I went into Seattle today, and I had the opportunity to try to figure some things out that have been bedeviling me as someone who wants to help the climate change movement. I also saw some parts of Seattle I haven't seen for years. I had one difficulty on my iPhone when a fight broke out, and I tried to summon 911, didn't evidently put the call through for some reason. And by the time I had finished a long hike, loop, and saw some policemen, my mind was occupied with the fact that I had been thinking out loud. So it was more the ironic issue in the neighborhood. And I say ironic because this is the book I picked up when I was over at University of Washington. It's often ironic the way that I play the margins, not necessarily intentionally. But when I say I'm more interested in the climate change movement um, than anything else, it's because we've had some dry run rehearsals in America where that's leading, like the Katrina hurricane. And so I stopped at the architectural large construction um, center at UW to discuss the fact that during Katrina, the stadium was a refuge for a lot of people, and what sort of dream projects might come up that I might be able to get references and citations to concerning areas in the third world that might benefit from having a center for um, congregation and safety from seasonal hurricanes as they might get worse. But like anyone else in my society, I'm bound by the moral issues of the day. And one of the things that's been bedeviling the um, climate change movement is the way that things have been playing out in Europe. And I tried to give some thought to the condition of the people in general who I'm peers with and who I read about and encounter in wire club discussions and so forth. Um, some of this might seem a little bit high minded, but keep in mind that there are elections going on. A fellow named J.D. Vance recently said America is a joke and was elected as a protege of Donald Trump. And a lot of people who I consider somewhat well to do in politics, like Omar, seem to have the attitude, well, I don't have to answer that arrogant stupidity on its face. But I got the feeling in the Wire Club chats that there were people who simply couldn't answer, couldn't decode what he was saying. I mean, it's easy to decode. All you have to do is read Abraham Lincoln. He said, let it be understood that we're a nation of laws, not a nation of crimes. So what he's saying is that bad lawmakers make a joke of America by passing laws that make it easier for us to be a nation of crime and harder for us to be um, a nation of laws. In other words, they're making a joke of us, people like J.D. Vance. I mean, it decodes easily enough. But when you can't, when you have a society that's having difficulty decoding those kinds of things, it's a measure of something. One of the things it seems to me to be a measure of is the loss of editorial journalism and the bankruptcy of our newspaper business and the balance provided by field reporters, people who went out and did research on location and looked to see with their own eyes and hear with their own ears what was happening. So if you have a problem that's a little bit more complicated, like what's going on in Ukraine. I mean, there's certain things that we agree not to disagree about. Like, for example, the central question of the madness is how can so many people be deemed expendable? But when you actually look at what is happening and question what is happening, there's a guard up against prying into questions that might be a little bit uncomfortable because they explain more than is being usually asked. One of those questions pertains to the new awareness of what they call oligarchs. Now, as we know, the oligarchy of many different European and American states are rich men who support one another. And they own yachts and they manipulate our politics and they buy our politicians and they own corporations that move and shake and have been around a long time, have had ups and downs in World War One and World War Two, et cetera, et cetera. Shipping magnates and so on. But when we actually look at the politics of Ukraine, we're asked to conceptualize it in a binary. It's a European nation that was at peace being invaded by a European nation who waged war on them, invaded them. And this binaryization results in being asked to choose sides. And anything that seems like you're not choosing sides is a collaborationist position against the side you should be choosing. And I'd like to argue that there's another point of view that you can arrive at. But let's look for a minute at the binarization. One of the things that we um, talk about in American politics quite a bit, not usually in terms of collaboration, usually more in terms of two timing and so on, seedy affairs that go on, trips to various islands and office help and so on. It's called a question of character. But where the question of character has come up in European politics, it has been more often an inquiry into obedience to authority. The question of character that was dramatized in the early 80s, um, pertaining to Germany during the 1930s and 40s, was a dramatization of the life of Gustav Gungans called Mephisto, who for a while was married to Thomas Mann's daughter, Erika. And they divorced, and he stayed in Germany, and he performed his famous role, Mephisto, for the German High Command, and he faced questions of collaboration. I've met Pierre Elliott, who was in Paris during the occupation with Gurdjieff. And they called themselves the idiots in Paris. They didn't face collaborationist charges because there didn't seem to be any question of them actually being involved with the authorities. They simply just weren't resisting actively the authorities, and some people are uncomfortable with that. So this is where we begin to see the overlap of um, Gurdjieff's society with the issues of content of character. And if you jump ahead to Beijing 2022, you'll remember that I was very interested in the performance of Kamila who sacrificed for fourth place in a fall from grace that was very dramatic and emotional. And she flipped the bird at the end and took fourth place. And what she did amounted to, when you look at the way that it was presented, particularly by the media, was a Pussy Riot. Now, Pussy Riot is a girls' rock band in Russia who have repeatedly been jailed by the authorities. Yet, Putin clearly authorized what Valieva did. So, although it's certainly an honest question, is Valieva playing the role of um, Gustav Gungren's Mephisto, a collaborator? Um, you have to see it in the context of what she was communicating when she took fourth place. She was signifying something that is an esoteric circle among the oligarchs. And that was the fourth way of the Ouspensky circle, who originated in Kharkov, Ukraine. And the Ouspensky circle traced back to the idiots in Paris. So it's a very ironic question in that way. Does it raise again the question of whether the esoteric circles of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky were collaborations in some way? So it's an honest and interesting question. But if you look at the stages of limited hangout that exist in our media pertaining to the Ouspensky circle, you go back to this time when Mephisto was made, the 80s, a time when Michael Foucault met with the Ayatollah, notorious French masochist, who's highly influential at the University of Washington. And when the Iran-Contra triangle was being played out, with Oliver North taking the blame for Reagan and the arms deal that was illegal. Well, during this time, the Ouspensky Circle appeared on 60 Minutes when Patricia Fripp appeared with Colin Powell. So on 60 Minutes, that's very mainstream. Colin Powell was a Republican supported by Reagan. So the Ouspensky Circle was clearly under the hood of the action. So we are faced with the dilemma of explaining why Putin was authorizing the Ouspensky Circle too. You see, Noam Chomsky is a sort of informer to the inside circle of intelligentsia at places like Washington. And he has said that there's two ways that a war can end. It can end in the defeat of one party or the other. It can end in a truce. But there's actually four ways. The third way is mutual annihilation. And that's what puts up a shield for the fourth way, which is a game of leapfrog behind the scenes by the oligarchy. Yachts may seem to be a symbol of the oligarchy, but many of these men are mystics who could walk away from their yachts, the way the Russian Orthodox Church regards Putin as their altar boy. They're the mystics of moralism. So it's a game of catch me if you can, curses forward again, and so forth. About the oligarchy and the Ouspensky fourth way, you have J.G. Bennett's spiritual hunger of the modern child. Now, it may be very tactless to say that there's a group of occultists in media who regard the Ukrainian war as answering the spiritual hunger of the modern child. But a central argument from American high command is exactly that. Thomas Lane was a critic of Kennedy because he believed that the spirit was at peace in war against evil. So the limited hangout I'm talking about is the way that media stopped short of telling everything during the 80s. We sort of got used to it. But it's ironic that the very thing they stopped short of explaining was Patricia Fripp's appearance on 60 Minutes with Colin Powell. It was exactly the point at which the Ouspensky circle became important, that um, the media stopped short from full explanations. So what we see in, for example, Oliver Stone's meeting with Putin is not a before and after situation the way you would think after they established the perimeter for the battle royal, which has cost so many people their lives, but a continuum, a sort of argument that we're in some sort of dilemma to define ourselves. Now, in the 80s again was a very interesting time for um, critics of society who felt that they might have keener insight into what was being left out by newspaper industry. You have to understand that the newspaper industry, when they began to leave things out, gave you the impression that they too were left out. There was something that they didn't dare think about, they didn't dare reveal. And what you find when you look under the hood at these times is that they left an opening for a South African journalist named Lauren Bughes to pen a book that explains and describes something that may have bothered you a little bit if you haven't read Moxieland. It's the story of a resistance in the future, a cyberpunk future, not far in the future, 100 years maybe in South Africa. A cyberpunk future where the resistance rebels, young kids again, cyberpunk kids, artists, take issue with a corporation. And it turns out at the end that the corporation, that their leader of the resistance is also the leader of the corporation who's using them to make himself more popular and powerful by capturing them. And this is the sort of thing that the Ouspensky crowd would look at very broadly as something that would help define the spiritual hunger of their times. So when we look at the situation with understanding the press, the press is an institution that inquires based on honest questions. But with its collapse, it's become more a question of collaborators. Are they playing the role of Mephisto? So it's very ironic that Valieva would be playing two roles at once. One is the question of is she playing the role of Mephisto as a collaborator, and yet at the same time opening the door to true understanding of what's going on with the Ouspensky circle. This reminds me of the fact that Donald Trump has made no secret of his position. It's almost like, why shouldn't I tell people flat out what's going on with me since they obviously won't understand? That's the question and underwrites the questions concerning Valieva. Getting back to J.D. Vance, why is it difficult for people to decode a politician in the Republican Party who says America is a joke? It shouldn't be that hard. Anything from Abraham Lincoln shows you that America is a nation of law. It's not a nation of jokes. He loved jokes, sure, but it shouldn't be that hard to decode. So it's a very difficult situation when you're looking at what's going on behind the scenes. Chomsky says a war can end two ways: defeat, a truce. There's a third way, which is mutual annihilation, but there's also a fourth way. It's the fourth way of the Ouspensky circle, a game of playing leapfrog behind the scenes. And the reason why I consider this important to understand is because I really strongly prefer to work on the climate change movement. And this situation has been bedeviling them something awful. So I just thought I'd try my level best to get to the bottom of it and, show you what I think are some honest questions about the arrangement.